Welcome to Human Minds, when everything you believe in comes into conflict with everything you love. What would you do? This story is about that exact moment, and it will leave many people torn between what is right and what is just. And when you see what happened, leave a comment. We want to hear your thoughts. Now, take a deep breath and listen with your heart. In a city where violence no longer shocks anyone, where the sound of sirens blends with birdsong in the early morning, there are still men who believe, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Men who hold on to their values, even when everything around them screams the opposite. It was exactly 6 a.m. when Sergeant Marcos Oliveira opened his eyes. An alarm wasn't necessary. His body had been trained for years to wake with the discipline of someone who doesn't allow himself to fail. At 47, his grey hair didn't ask for permission anymore. It dominated his head with dignity, like silent medals earned through 25 years of military police service. His face told the story of everything he'd lived, every line a trace of responsibility, every crease a reminder of sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and promises made and kept. But behind that firm expression still lived the same youthful gaze, the one from decades ago, when he joined the force, with a proud chest and a simple dream: to protect and serve. Marcos got up slowly, careful not to break the silence of the house. In the room next door, Daniel was still asleep, 19 years old, a law student, an easy smile and a good heart. He was Marcos's greatest pride, his son, his companion, his living legacy with Marina, the woman he had lost 5 years earlier in a car accident that still hurt like it had just happened. In the kitchen, Marcos's movements were almost ceremonial. He picked up the kettle, filled it with fresh water, lit the burner, and set out 2 mugs. Black coffee, strong, just the way he liked it. And the way Daniel said he was, still trying to like, but drank anyway. It was a simple ritual, maybe even silly. But for them, it was sacred. A moment where father and son reconnected before heading out into their own battles. 2 soldiers on different missions. While stirring in the sugar, Marcos whispered softly, just as he did every morning. "One more day, Marina. One more day taking care of our boy." Daniel showed up shortly after, still drowsy, hair messy, his face slightly creased from the pillow. He yawned, walked over to his father, and hugged him from behind, resting his chin on Marcos's shoulder, just like he used to when he was a child. A gesture that time hadn't erased. "Let's have dinner together tonight?" he asked, his voice sluggish. "It's been a while since we really sat down and talked." Marcos smiled, that restrained smile of someone trying to look tough, but already moved. "Of course. I'll leave work early for that. A father's promise." "Deal then. I'll be home around 6:30. Just 2 classes today. We can order." "Pizza?" Marcos gave him a light pat on the shoulder. "You and that refined palate of yours." Daniel laughed. "It's tradition. Don't mess with our tradition." At the table, while drinking their coffee, Marcos's phone buzzed. A message from a fellow officer congratulating him for another commendation he had received the week before. It was a frequent thing. Praise, recognition, awards he never asked for, but they kept showing up. Daniel peeked over his father's shoulder and said, "You know you're kind of a living legend in there, right?" Marcos shrugged. "Legend? Nothing. I just do what's right." "And that's exactly why they admire you, Dad. I've never seen you do anything wrong. Not even a little lie." Marcos set his cup down, turned to his son, and cupped Daniel's face in both hands. He looked straight into his eyes, as if trying to leave something etched deep inside. "Son, you're already better than I ever was. You've got compassion, and you've got justice in your heart. Don't ever lose that. The world needs people like you." Daniel simply nodded, swallowing hard. In that moment, there was a kind of silence between them that didn't need words. Just respect and love. Marcos kissed his son's forehead, a small gesture, but filled with history. At the 15th Battalion of the Military Police, Marcos's arrival wasn't marked by sirens or fanfare. It was something more subtle, more powerful, silent respect, discreet glances. A nod that spoke louder than words. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't need to flash medals to be remembered. Marcos was the kind of man who walked into a room and made everything feel more right. He walked through the corridors, greeting each colleague by name, and not just by name. He remembered one officer's sick daughter, another's hospitalized father, a third's anxiety about trying to get into officer training. He didn't just lead, he cared. And in an environment where toughness was the norm, that was rare. Within the force, Marcos was seen as a compass, a moral north in a sea of cynicism that slowly tried to swallow even the best among them. Young officers came to him with questions that went far beyond tactics and weaponry. They wanted to know how to stay clean, how to handle the mistakes of their peers, how to resist when everything around them seemed to push the other way. And Marcos, patient as always, answered, always with that same gaze, the look of someone who had seen a lot but never let his heart grow cold. That morning, Lieutenant Rodriguez called him in for a private conversation. He was holding a memo from Internal Affairs. They wanted Marcos to become an ethics instructor at the police academy, a rare invitation, usually offered only to high-ranking officers, but in this case, they made an exception. "There's no one better than you to teach what it really means to be a police officer," the lieutenant said. Marcos was silent for a moment. He understood the weight of that offer. Training new officers meant shaping the future of the force. It was a responsibility that couldn't be taken lightly. "You're the one everyone here trusts. In 25 years, you've never let anyone down. You're the example we need to multiply." Marcos nodded slowly. He felt something shift inside him when he heard those words. A kind of honor that didn't come with medals, but with expectation. The kind of honor that demanded even more integrity than he already asked of himself. The conversation was interrupted by a burst of static from the radio. A voice from dispatch announced an urgent situation. Armed robbery on Central Avenue, near number 1247. The suspect had fled on a red motorcycle, heading towards San Jose neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice was tense. "Suspect is armed and extremely agitated. Back up en route." Marcos was only 2 blocks away. He radioed his position, turned on the siren, and hit the gas. The roar of the patrol car's engine sliced through the morning air like a reminder that the world didn't wait for good intentions. Even the calmest days could turn in an instant. As he drove through familiar streets, Marcos felt his old instincts kick in. The kind of adrenaline that never ages. But beneath that, there was a strange unease. A sense that something about this day was off. When he arrived at the robbery scene, he found a small crowd gathered outside the store. Donna Helena, the shop owner, was crying uncontrollably in the middle of the sidewalk. A few neighbors tried to comfort her. Others just watched in silence. The city had seen many robberies, but each one still hurt. Marcos approached with his usual calm, knelt beside the woman, and offered her a cup of water. He waited for her to take a deep breath before asking what had happened. Between sobs, she described a young man in a hoodie and dark glasses. He came in shouting, nervous. The gun shook in his hands. He seemed more desperate than dangerous. "He apologized, Sergeant. He said he didn't want to do it, that he really needed the money." That sentence echoed in Marcos's mind. It wasn't common to hear that from a robber. Hatred, coldness, cynicism, that was common. But remorse, desperation, that wasn't. He wrote down the details, trying to mentally piece together his next steps when the radio crackled again. New call. A red motorcycle, matching the description, had just run over 2 people on Avenida das Flores, a mother and her daughter. The suspect fled at high speed. Victims in critical condition rushed to Central Hospital. Marcos's heart pounded. He knew without a shadow of a doubt it was the same suspect, and in that moment, the case stopped being just a call code. It now had a face. 2, maybe 3. And the day, which had begun with pizza and promises, was already darkening, even under the morning sun. Central Hospital was less than 10 minutes away from the scene of the hit and run. Marcos didn't wait for backup. He'd already waited too long. The city seemed to move in slow motion as he passed through intersections, weaved around school buses, and tried to contain the storm building in his chest. This wasn't just another call. There was something else. He couldn't explain it, but the weight, the urgency. It was unlike anything he'd felt in a long time. When he reached the emergency room, he was met with a kind of silent chaos. Nurses rushing through hallways. Doctors speaking quickly, but quietly. People crying silently in waiting room chairs. Marcos quickly identified himself and asked for information about the victims of the accident. Dr. Roberto approached, a doctor in a wrinkled white coat, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He spoke with the kind of voice that sounded trained to deliver bad news with the least amount of pain possible. The mother suffered fractures in her arm, some facial cuts. But she's conscious. She'll be okay. Marcos nodded. He had expected that, but he also knew the hardest part was coming next. The daughter, the little girl, is in an induced coma, severe cranial trauma. She's on a ventilator. The next few days will be critical. The image of a child, unconscious and connected to machines, invaded Marcos's mind before he even saw her. And it hurt. It hurt like it was personal, as if that suffering had already become part of his story. Dr. Roberto led him to the observation room, where the mother, Carla, sat beside her daughter's bed. She looked about 35, dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face pale and bruised. But her eyes, oh, her eyes, they were wide open, like they'd seen a kind of abyss no one else could comprehend. Amanda, the little girl, lay there, small, fragile, blonde hair disheveled, her fingers unmoving over the white hospital sheet. The monitor beside her beeped in steady intervals, as if refusing to let anyone forget that there was still life there. Still time. Marcos stood silently for a few moments, just watching. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to ask questions. He simply wanted to be there. But he needed to understand. He needed answers. He approached carefully, introduced himself in a low voice, and gently asked if he could speak with her. Carla looked at him as if seeing through him. She told him they had been crossing the street at a crosswalk. Amanda had been laughing at something her mother had just said. It was a normal morning, a simple moment, a happy one. And then, the motorcycle. He was coming fast. Way too fast. Kept looking over his shoulder. He didn't try to stop, didn't try to swerve. He just went through. She said the rider paused for a moment after the crash. Almost got off the bike, but didn't. He fled. Marcos took down every word. The hoodie, the silhouette, the panic, the regret. But deep down, none of it mattered, because none of it would bring Amanda back. When he said goodbye to the mother, Marcos left the hospital with a knot in his throat. He had seen many tragedies in his career. He had seen parents bury children. He had seen children cry over mothers. But that little girl, so small, so innocent, it was too much. Back in his patrol car, Marcos took a long breath. He picked up the radio, requested full mobilization in the São José neighborhood, confirmed the location where the red motorcycle had been found. It was close, very close. And with that, the model officer, the devoted father, the future instructor. In that moment, he became something else. He became a man in pursuit of justice, or perhaps a man chasing something he himself couldn't name. Marcos drove through the streets with the precision of someone who knew every curve, every alley, every crack in the asphalt. For 25 years, he had traveled these same paths, sometimes to arrest, sometimes to console, sometimes just to try to prevent the inevitable. But that day, everything felt different. There was no music on the radio, no chatter with fellow officers on the comms. There was only him, the steering wheel, and the silence between one heartbeat and the next. Carla's words kept echoing in his mind like a broken mantra. He didn't even try to stop. He kept looking back, and then he ran. At every corner, he imagined Amanda's panic, the scream that never came, the hard thud against the pavement. He imagined the mother, frozen by fear, unable to protect her child. And no matter how hard he tried to separate emotion from duty, as all his years of training had taught him, he couldn't. He was a police officer, but before that, he was a father. Around 3 in the afternoon, dispatch sent in a lead. A red motorcycle had been found near San Jose neighborhood, abandoned behind a dumpster on a quiet street. The license plates had been removed. There were fresh scratches on the frame, signs of a fall. Marcos arrived within minutes. He turned off the siren before making the final turn. He wanted to hear the environment, feel the air. He stepped out of the patrol car and examined the bike with a trained eye. Yes, it was the one. The scratches, the color, the engine still warm. Adrenaline surged through his body. The suspect had to be nearby. It was impossible to have gotten far on foot in so little time. Armed with cold patience and sharp instinct, Marcos began searching the area on foot. Every step was measured. His eyes scanned alleyways, upper windows of rundown buildings, half-open shutters, suspicious silences. He knew these streets well. He'd arrested robbers, dealers, scammers here. He understood the patterns of those who ran. He knew that desperation rarely hides well. Time seemed to drip forward, slow and deliberate, until something broke the rhythm. A soft sound, barely noticeable. The dragging of something across the ground. A muffled thud, a breath held in a place where no one should be. Marcos followed the sound to a narrow alley, wedged between 2 abandoned buildings. The walls were damp and stained, forming a kind of tunnel. Sunlight barely touched the ground there. It was the kind of place where time didn't enter. At the end, half crouched, half hidden, was a figure, facing away, wearing a hoodie, trembling. Marcos's heart jumped. He was close to closing the case. With steady hands, he drew his weapon and aimed. His voice came out strong, no shouting, just pure authority. "Military police! Stand up slowly, hands in the air. Now." The figure froze. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, slowly, the arms rose, hesitant, shaking. Marcos stepped closer, weapon steady, eyes locked on the suspect's back. Something about the way the body moved felt off. Not the aggression he was used to, more like hesitation, a fear that wasn't just of the police, but of the world. "Turn around." Slowly, the young man began to turn. First the shoulders, then the head. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes. The hoodie still covered most of his face, but even so, something was there. A chill, a sense. Marcos didn't know what it was, but something inside him began to tighten. A memory? A suspicion? No. Something else. Familiarity, and it grew with each passing second, with every inch of that face still hidden beneath the hood. The silence in the alley was almost sacred. Even the sounds of the city seemed to respect that moment. Cars on the nearby street slowed down, as if instinctively sensing that something delicate was about to unfold. The world, in that narrow strip of concrete and shadows, had begun to slow. Marcos held his weapon steady, his feet grounded, but his heart no longer felt like it was part of his body. It floated somewhere between past and present, between duty and instinct. The suspect, now facing him, still wore the dark sunglasses. The hoodie cast a shadow over his features. His lips trembled, his jaw was tense, and his shoulders familiar. Strangely familiar. There were the gestures too. Small, involuntary, like the way he curled his fingers when nervous. Marcos swallowed hard. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Not from force, but from fear. Take off the hood and the glasses. The young man hesitated. For a moment, he stood frozen. Then his hands began to move slowly. First the glasses. His trembling fingers pulled them down, and when his eyes became visible, something inside Marcos shattered. It wasn't confirmation, it was impact. Even before the hood came down, he already knew. He knew by the way his heart leapt. He knew by how the ground seemed to vanish beneath his feet. The hood fell, and there he was. Daniel, his son, the boy he had cradled when he cried in the dark, the teenager he had guided through questions of love and justice. The young man who, that very morning, had promised to be home by 6:30 for pizza. There, in front of him. Hands raised, face smeared with dirt, cheeks streaked with tears, eyes wide with panic. Marcos didn't say a word. He couldn't. It felt as though the entire world had folded in on itself, as if every truth he had stood on for a lifetime had just been pulled out from under him. The sea, weapon in his hand, began to tremble, for the first time in his entire career. He didn't know what to do. Daniel took a small step forward, slowly, like walking on glass. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to explain. He just looked the way someone does when they're pleading, but know they might not deserve forgiveness. Marcos stared back. But it wasn't the look he gave to criminals. It was the look of a father lost inside his own chest, of a man who had spent his life teaching what was right, and now had to decide if that right could survive this kind of pain. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Other units were closing in. Time, which had hung still just moments before, was now beginning to move again. Marcos knew he had seconds, maybe less. The radio on his shoulder crackled with voices calling his name. He didn't answer. All he could hear was his own breathing and the whisper of memories. Daniel running through. The yard at 8, in a shirt 3 sizes too big. Daniel shaking after receiving his first college report card. Daniel that morning, hugging him from behind, like he used to when he was little. And now, Daniel, in a damp hoodie, with eyes full of guilt. The dilemma was no longer between right and wrong. It was between love and conviction, between justice and blood, between the man Marcos had been for 25 years and the father he was still trying to be. The alley seemed to shrink with each passing second. The sound of sirens now flooded the air, approaching with the raw fury of a city trying, clumsily, violently, to make justice happen. Marcos didn't move. His weapon was still raised, his eyes fixed on the figure standing before him. The young man, now fully visible, kept his hands raised. The hood had fallen, revealing a face marked not by age, but by something far deeper, a kind of desperation that can't be taught and can't be faked. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He didn't say a single word. He just stood there, frozen, before a man who had devoted his entire life to order and law. A man who, until that very day, had never once doubted his mission. Marcos watched him with a strange mix of disbelief and confusion. It was like looking into a cracked mirror. Part of him saw just another young man, unlike so many he had arrested before. But there was something more, not a memory, not a suspicion, just a growing discomfort, like cold air creeping in through a forgotten open window. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. A firm voice, Unit 015, we need your position. Patrol approaching the perimeter. He pressed the button, but said nothing, not out of hesitation, but because he didn't know what to say. The young man still hadn't spoken. Only the sound of his breath could be heard, mixing with the heavy beat of sirens in the distance. "Identification," Marcos ordered at last. The young man hesitated. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Only a long exhale, as if saying his name would, by itself, be a step with no return. Marcos stepped closer, maintaining his posture. His eyes searched the boys for clues, some thread of truth, but all he found was confusion, pain, and something he couldn't name. "Speak!" he barked, sharper now. "Full name!" That's when the boy, with trembling hands, took off his glasses and, without a word, slowly raised his hood, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. Time crumbled into dust between seconds. The air disappeared. The sounds of the city faded. Marcos felt his body freeze, like his entire nervous system had been ripped from him. There, standing in front of him, light brown hair, green eyes he had known since the day they first opened. Features, an exact blend of him and Marina. The face he had kissed on the forehead just that same morning. Daniel. His son was standing in that alley, hands raised, looking straight at him with an expression of absolute terror. The son he had raised alone, the boy he taught to tie his shoes and shave, the teenager he defended at the school board meeting, the student who dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Daniel, the same Daniel who, just hours before, had promised to come home early for dinner. And now, he was here, as a suspect, as a fugitive, as a criminal. The impact wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Marcos felt his legs weaken. His arm, still holding the weapon, began to lose strength. His hand trembled, for the first time in decades. Daniel looked at him. There was no mask anymore, no defense, just glassy eyes, parted lips, tears rolling down his face. Neither of them said a word. Marcos didn't speak. Daniel didn't explain. The city kept breathing outside, but inside that alley, everything was frozen. The model officer, the principled father, now stood at the edge of an impossible crossroads, between the oath of justice and the flesh of his own blood, and he had only seconds to decide. Marcos couldn't remember ever feeling anything like this. Not on the day he got the news that Marina had died. Not during the shootouts he survived in operations that nearly didn't end. Not even in the long nights when he drove home alone in the rain, wondering if the badge still meant anything. Nothing compared to what he felt now. Standing before him was his son, the boy he had raised with love, with discipline, with effort. The child he used to hug after nightmares. The teenager he had taught how to be a man. The same boy who, that very morning, had shared coffee with him, like they did every single day, and now, there he was, hands raised, guilt carved into his face, eyes saying everything that words never could. Marcos's weapon was still raised, but he no longer felt its weight. It was as if he were holding an extension of an entire life that, at that moment, was questioning its own purpose. In his mind, scenes exploded like flashes. Amanda, hooked to machines in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Carla, the mother, her face cut and bruised, holding her daughter's hand in silence. Donna Helena, still trembling as she recalled the young man who had apologized before fleeing. And now, all of it pointed to Daniel. His Daniel. The son he believed he knew better than himself. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask why, wanted some explanation, any explanation, something that might make it bearable, something that might bend the absurd into something he could survive. But there was no time. The sirens were just one block away. The hurried steps of fellow officers echoed down the streets. In seconds, this alley would no longer belong to just the two of them. And he knew. He knew what that meant. If he arrested Daniel, there would be no turning back. His son would become a headline. He'd be judged, condemned, labeled, carrying the weight of public shame, as if he alone had sinned in a country full of sinners. And he, Marcos, would be the man who brought him in, the father who turned him in, the officer who followed the law all the way to the end, even if that end was his own son. But if he let him go, if he lowered the weapon, if he bought time, created a distraction, opened an escape path, he would no longer be the man he had always been. He'd throw away the principles that had kept him upright for 25 years. He'd betray his colleagues, his values, the victims. He'd betray Amanda, and the city would know. Maybe not that day, but one day. And the name Sergeant Marcos Oliveira, once synonymous with honor, would be remembered as the man who chose blood over truth. Daniel's breathing was unsteady. The boy took half a step forward. It wasn't an attempt to run. It wasn't aggression. It was surrender. The look he gave his father didn't ask to be saved. It asked for forgiveness. Marcos felt the tears run down his face, silently. He couldn't remember the last time he cried. Maybe when Marina died. Maybe not even then. But now, it was unavoidable. Because standing in front of him wasn't just a suspect. It was the boy he brought into this world. And now that boy was forcing him to choose between justice and love. And there was no time. The officer's footsteps were getting louder. Someone called his name from far away. He had seconds to decide what kind of man he would be, when everything he believed in collided with everything he loved. At the hospital, Amanda was still fighting for her life. At the precinct, Donna Helena waited for the suspect to be brought in. At home, a pizza waited to be ordered, a dinner that would never happen. And in that alley, father and son stared at each other, knowing nothing would ever be the same. What does a man do when everything he believes in comes into conflict with everything he loves? What does a father choose when he has to decide between justice and his own